Delicate subject. Chapter 16. The ship was fully repaired before she was. It took her a few weeks before the dizziness fully settled, but only a few days before she was restored to duty, taking back the reins from Miranda and checking in with everyone, redistributing, provisioning, and refitting berths for the new roster. This being Omega, on screening, Edie had to reject 1 out of 5 oncoming shipments for irregularities, but mostly the miscounted and counterfeit sort, only a few being the explosive or bugged sort. It would be nice if this was unusual, but it wasn't. When they traced counterfeit deliveries, the suppliers knew nothing of it, suspecting their communications had been bugged and shipments swapped, promising to arrange better security. She doubted it would make much of a difference. The Normandy was a prized destination, and she might be putting suppliers at risk. The suppliers were on Omega, and that said enough about them. Necessary in this case, emergency circumstances. But she'd known if she'd had a choice, she wouldn't have put in on Omega. She sent a list of irregularities to Arya, asked for advice on trustworthy suppliers, just for the fun and spite of it. Omega was the first jump-off point for a lot of crew that were leaving, so they threw a party in Afterlife to celebrate victory and say goodbye to Tally, Zaid, Grunt, Samara, and Jacob. Tally was going to be her inside Quarian. Tally had not been able to seriously consider staying on the Normandy, and Jane agreed the best place for her right now was attempting to bring sanity to the Quarian political process. Tally sat on Garrus's lap for the majority of the party, getting progressively drunker and unbearably sad about leaving. Jane was trying to reassure her, as was Garrus, while Tally was starting to slur her words. "But I'm abandoning you. I'm abandoning you again, Shepard." Garrus had tipped his crest to her helmet. As Jane said, "Tally, you're not. I think you're doing the right thing. It's a hard thing, which means that it has more significance. We would love for you to stay, but your people are crazy. Kinda like mine. It's gonna get worse. They need you. I need you to let me know if they're gonna implode and take out that sector of space." Legion had heard, and he stepped to Tally's side, tentatively put a hand on her shoulder. "Creator Tally's aura. There are things that must change. Shepard Commander has no authority among Quarians. You do. You have proven yourself to your people several times over, through saving the Citadel, through providing information about the heretics during your pilgrimage, through your actions at the Collector base. Conversations with you have convinced us that peace is possible, that we can all turn toward cooperation. It will be difficult, but nobody else can do it." To everyone's surprise, Tally lurched off Garrus's lap and draped herself over Legion with a mournful and appreciative sob. Garrus's mouth quirked at Legion's apparent alarm, but he said, "You found good words, Legion. It's true, Tally. Oh, we'll miss you every day." Tally sobbed a bit harder, turned to Jane for a painful hug, then back to Garrus's lap, turned facing him and crying, until Jane patted her back and left them murmuring to each other. Jane turned to Legion. "Would you care for a dance, Legion?" Legion stood still, his faceplates moved in agitated array. "You are an odd person, Shepard Commander." She grabbed his hand. "Damn right I am. Come on, I'll show you a few steps." He didn't argue and couldn't dance, and she had too much fun to give a damn. She had to go slow. Her leg was still tender and painful, but the bulky medical device was off, replaced by a compression mesh. She was going to have a hell of a few nasty scars where bone had punched through in several places and flesh had split. At the end of the song, which came quickly and to his obvious relief, she took his hand. "There is gratitude you are staying, Legion. Legion gave an awkward attempt at a bow. There is gratitude to have a place, Shepard Commander. Allowed to coordinate with Creator Talizora and with you, odds of success against the old machines for the Geth rise. The Geth shall rise. She smiled. Sounds like that would make a great vid, too. The best vids have many explosions. You've been talking to Zaid. It is a common opinion. She agreed with him. Too many explosions, Legion. Glad you will be there with me. Too many explosions, Shepard Commander. Zaid was occupied during the party, surrounded by friends that were indistinguishable from mercs, dancers, employees of the bar, or models. He decided to take his outrageous fee that he hadn't expected to live to spend, and spend it. Perhaps there was some wisdom on that ship after all. And now it was leaving. She wished him long life, and helped with the bank balance. He should not have to work again, but she suspected he'd spent a great deal of time tracking Vito with his fortune. Jacob had said he had personal business to attend to, and she didn't ask any further. He told her that it had been an honor to work with her, that she was an inspiration, and she shook his hand and thanked him for his service, wished him the best of luck with his endeavors, whatever they were. Although the party was also partly in Samara's honor, she did not attend. Omega and Afterlife had bad memories for her. A solemn visit, a shared meditation session, Samara releasing herself from Shepard's service formally, had taken place on the Normandy, and Samara had already gone on her transport, though she was celebrated in absentia. The loudest toast was from Zaid to a goddamn beautiful woman who could kick my arse. Grunt broke a lot of things. He went on a stubborn rant about the fragility of goods that weren't made on Tuchanka, and, well, Arya knew she was good for the money. So far, the generous deposit that was turning into a fee had kept security from putting holes in Grunt. She had to intervene a few times to keep Grunt from breaking people, and Thane also watched over him while she was circulating. Grunt finally got his wish for a training session with Thane disabling him within a few seconds. Grunt spent the rest of the party demanding more demonstrations until Thane left him slumped over in a booth. Jack laughed, promised disingenuously to make sure Grunt didn't get robbed, then shrugged and walked away. Jane looked at Grunt skeptically and then asked Thane, "Does he have a ticket yet to Tuchanka?" "I do not know. I would not suggest leaving him here unattended. Arya does not appear to lack for a sense of humor. No doubt, along with your reimbursement, she would not mind conscripting him to the blood pack." You sound like you approve. "With my sympathies to the blood pack." Jane activated her Omni-tool. "Edie, what are Grunt's plans? Does he have a berth here?" "He is leaving in 14.26 hours on the Nadir. Docking berth 2937. That was a terrible name for a ship. She attributed it to the bizarre Krogan sense of humor, or it meaning something else. "Is he already checked in?" "Yes." Jane put an arm under Grunt's shoulder, and Thane sighed and put an arm around the other. And they lugged Grunt to the transport pad and from there to the docking berth. When Grunt woke up and tried walking and drunkenly arguing for himself, Thane put him out again quickly. "Is that good for a growing Krogan?" "They have redundant nervous systems. It should do him no harm. If it were to do him harm, I doubt the deficit could be detected." When they got him to his berth and rolled him into bed in his fortunately private cabin with all his stuff already there, Jane kissed him on his sleeping cheek, filmed the moment for posterity, and sent the clip to his Omni-tool. waving goodbye and then prompting a reluctant Thane to wave goodbye as well. She said a cheery, "Have fun storming Tuchanka." She was so very proud of her crew, but the celebratory edge was wearing off and fatigue setting in. She was going to miss the energy of the renegade Normandy, but the people that remained had her loyalty and full support. Jack, Legion, Thane, and Garrus were available for ground crew missions. Miranda opted to continue in her executive function, maintaining the Normandy, monitoring Thane's condition, monitoring Jane's not deadness, corresponding with Oriana, and staying mobile, away from Cerberus and Retribution. Morden would continue research and coordination on Reaper-Tech, Capral Syndrome, and his other projects. Kasumi would technically consult, but would also be periodically and unpredictably uncommunicative and unavailable. She spent a great deal of time on unlocking the information on KG's gray box. The Normandy now had a specialized transport craft for her and an additional shuttle, assuming that more people would need to come and go on special projects, legitimate and otherwise. Jane stroked a hand over Grunt's loudly snoring form, and he swatted at her, and she decided that was the best note for a farewell. She linked an arm with Thane, and they left the ship. They were quiet, and he steered her away from the direction back to Afterlife, led her not far to an alcove that had a stunning view of the center column of Omega and the red glow of enormous spokes. He sat on a ledge and pulled her down into his lap. Thane had spent more time lately in the medbay than she had, and despite looking perfectly fine, Karen had assured her that he had been, again, in a great deal of pain, refusing medication and insisting on keeping a clear head. They hadn't had much time together during their separate recoveries other than public pawning for games and private moments spent quietly in bed, tangentially touching each other, Thane respecting the no-exertion rule. He was more damaged than she was internally. Karen had briefed her on his condition. Drell didn't bruise like humans or scar like Turians, and he gave no outward signs of the internal derangement of his organs caused by massive crush injuries. His skin was not always an accurate indicator. Karen said he had not allowed her near him and had made one quiet, unrepeatable, and effective threat that had kept her from trying to disable him or asking anybody else to try. He'd received some treatment before he'd held Jane's leg together. But after that, he had spent days internally bleeding, coughing up blood, watching over Garrus and Jane, unwilling to sleep until Garrus regained consciousness and convinced Thane to rest. Garrus had talked Thane into being willing to be scanned and treated, with Karen's promise to not sedate him and Garrus's promise to watch over Jane and wake him if. The if went undefined, but Garrus had promised any if he would. After treatment, Thane allowed sleep after 2 days. Thane fell asleep with Garrus holding onto him at Jane's bedside, Garrus's hand under Jane's, and Thane's hand on top of theirs. And so it had gone while she was oblivious. Time, torturing the men she loved, both trying to comfort the other and able to do so only so far. Their own wounds and separate reckoning of internal guilt and blame rebounding through their nervous systems as their hearts refused to shut down. She understood vigilance to the exclusion of all other things. She was grateful and horrified to have earned that level of devotion. They hadn't spoken of any of this, and Thane did not seem inclined to visit the events after the collector base, moving on as though it were a completed chapter, an assassination, the mission specs buried out of habit, training, and inclination. Words clamored but stuck behind her teeth and clogged her throat until she swallowed them back, opting to sit to look at the impossibility wrought in the cold dead of space that was Omega. She'd seen in Liara's files that Thane was responsible for the 1-hour massacre that had eliminated 37 people from this station. Out of curiosity, she'd done some research of her own. The massacre had taken much less than an hour. From the forensics, it looked like simultaneous explosions and poisons and traps had done the majority of the damage. The few single headshot bullet wounds matched the gun Thane favored, the gun used to shoot Nisana. It was likely the only external insight into his career she was going to get, and it had happened after Erica's death, so it probably had been related to that. It being Omega, the event was publicized, with spotty surveillance footage of blurred green in his shade, no identification, just astronomical rewards for information leading to the assailant. Bodies of several very bad people had never been recovered and have been listed as last known location, verifiable only up to that hour. She suspected they were the victims Thane had chosen to linger, possibly using the massacre as destruction of infrastructure and communication to flush out those he was truly after. She wasn't going to ask. She wasn't going to ask him about anything right now. She closed her eyes, held onto his hand, and let the gentle trance of venom soak through her, appreciating the barbed safety of his arms around her and the smooth, textured glide of his skin under her fingertips. They were concealed from the view of the main pedway, but someone with a cigarette had ventured over to the railing to take in the view himself. She ignored him and the scent of smoke, wrapped in her own moment, until he said, "Well, isn't that just fucking adorable?" Her eyes opened and her facial expressions didn't change as she looked at him. Human. Tall. Purposely intimidating. Scarred. Armored and armed. He took a long drag, blew out the smoke, and tossed the cigarette aside. "You've got to be the stupidest tourists I have ever seen. But this is my lucky day. How much did she pay for a drill whore? I bet I can get more for you." The man drew a gun. "Come on out. Can't decide if I should sell you or just rent you out. High and hard for a little while first. Sell you once your curb appeal has gone down." Thane's demeanor changed subtly, and she took a cue from him. He made no sound, but his hand on hers held her down physically so she couldn't rise, while appearing as though he were holding on to her for support. As he stepped away from her, he looked terrified, diminished, mincing and fearful, hunched with his hands up, shaking. And it was impossible that was Thane. She wasn't scared for a moment, but she was fascinated and managing to hide it behind feigned terror. Her performance didn't matter because the man wasn't looking at her. Their attempted tormentor appeared to straighten, swell in size like a threatening animal with hackles up and fur puffed out, enjoying intimidation and relishing a promise of good times ahead. Fuck. I haven't had snakehead in a while. You're worth 10, human bitches. The man lifted Thane's chin to look at him, and from there it was a blur. Thane struck him in the neck so he couldn't make a sound other than a horrible choking wheeze. He removed the man's weapon from his hand and placed it in its holster. He then broke every finger on the offending hand inside his armored gloves, piercing bent shards of metal and broken bone and bleeding. And then Thane took his other hand, broke every finger there until metal snapped open. The man was trying to scream but couldn't, purple face etched deep with pain. Thane retrieved the gun from its holster and shot through the flexible joints of both knees, crushing the man's toes under his heels as a seeming afterthought. The man began to topple back, but Thane pulled him forward until he collapsed down. Thane's knee met the man's face, ruining it in a spatter of blood and bone. The man's broken body slumped to the floor, and he gurgled until Thane's foot on his neck with a twist and a muffled snap ended it, except for a few remaining twitches. Thane turned back to her, and she was snarled with processing what it was she should be feeling. Should it be recognition that it was what she would have wanted to do? Horror? Surprise? Jealousy? Gratitude? Was that what she would have wanted to do, or would she have disarmed him? Shot him? Would she have caused as much pain as she could, as Thane did? Would she have had the courage or honesty it took to do it when someone was watching her, or would she have shot him once, clean, with regret later of lost chances and a false sense of moral superiority? If it weren't Omega, and it had happened on the Citadel, would she have immobilized him and turned him over, or murdered him? She had no idea, but Thane looked sure. He looked at her face, and the turmoil, or lack of turmoil there, tilted his head slightly in consideration, and then set his jaw, came to her, lifted her by the waist, and pressed her back further, around a support strut, concealed from view in the relative shadows. His hand was at the back of her neck, his forehead to hers. His breath was steady, his pulse slow under her fingertips on his skin. She was the only one with racing heart and panting breath. I have watched you, seen your face as I took a killing blow on any of the many of those who we have come across that have tried to demean you, though often Garrus's rifle found them first. You never choose them as targets. You leave them for us. And the more time I spend with you, the more I see your face. I want to know, Jane. Tell me if the person or people that raped you are dead, or do they still walk somewhere safe from your wrath, but not mine? She closed her eyes, speechless, flooded with memory and damned by her face. Memories led to dreams of binding and pain, and she guessed she talked in her sleep. His hand tightened and his voice drew her back, opened her eyes. She was so accustomed to encouraging him to express his whims and indulging them by habit, she wanted to answer when he said, simplifying the request, "You do not need to think to answer. Are they alive? Yes or no?" She could give him that. A bitten-off piece of a story she'd been forced to swallow. Something she could spit out, purge. No. She hoped he'd believe her. It was true, and there was no need to lie. Words slipped out to help convince him. He was a sick animal, and I couldn't let him live. He hurt people before me, he would have hurt more people after me. Then a cold spear of something else struck her, and she remembered how Thane knew she sometimes wished for death. And maybe she didn't have to talk in her sleep. She asked him, "And you? Are yours dead, or do they still walk?" She remembered drinks bought and ignored, that he'd just been called a whore, more valuable than she could ever be, that being a Drell and being who he was drew eyes and speculation, had drawn both of those things from her. It was inseparable from who he was, and he had trained to use it. He had been trained to use it. His breath drew in sharp, and there was a moment of hesitation. But he had demanded honesty, and he would give it. I do not know their names. It was part of my training. My introduction to sex at age 14 was being told to volunteer for an unknown testing vital to my education, and that to fail would invalidate all my prior service. A trial of courage and endurance. I chose, and I took pride in enduring the trial. 4 people. A Drell female, a Taurian male, and a Sari female, and a Drell male. Through a cycle or longer, I do not know the length of time. No food, no water, no rest, and every act they could fit into that time frame. I obeyed orders. At the end, I was asked to thank them for my education, and I did. She was outraged and sick, started to cry, shaking her head in denial, rocking her forehead against his. Her story choked and slid back in her throat, and all that was left was his story, disgust and pity and horror. There was more to her story, more to his. These were the tips of icebergs that sheeted, unyielding into cold, slid into dark. Right now, he only cared that there was nobody else he had to kill, had she been unable. She had been able. I saw it on your face at the slavers. I see it in your face when you are threatened, specifically for your beauty, for your gender, for your daring to exist as a soldier despite expectation of ornamentation and potential sexual value. There is no degradation of gender or beauty in Drell culture. I have been exposed to it often and intensely in your presence. I do not understand how you, who have defied so many expectations, allow this to happen and will laugh at it, dismiss it as harmless. I will never understand, and each time the pattern repeats, my rage grows. At them, at you for allowing it. I will murder without mercy when it happens. I will cause pain, set an example you should set. Be prepared. It is distinctly human behavior, and something inexplicable in you, human in you, has driven you to expect it, to allow it. The behavior spreads to honor-lost Taurians, Batarians, and Vorcha, knowing they can taunt you without reply because human males do it, and you will allow it because you are accustomed to it enough to have grown numb to it. I claim the right to kill them, Jane. And I claim the right to return to you when you look at me as though you wished they had more fingers. Something inside her stirred, stretched, almost preened, seen in hibernation and admired for sleek fur and sharp claws and teeth. Something blood-spattered. She had never told anybody, but he knew from watching her, from knowing her fight responses, from knowing something was in the way of her otherwise restless trigger finger, from knowing what it had done to him, kindred, and code. She didn't argue with him, acknowledging that humans like the one whose blood was pooling and cooling were vile and deserved a painful death. As Commander Shepard, she was witnessed and judged, and she had to restrain herself. She had to rise above expectation of personal insult. She could not afford outrage, had to stay calm. But he was right. Those reasons were all true, but not the truth. She'd been made to feel helpless, and her response was cold reserve, refusing to be touched. He and Garrus always focused on anybody who attempted to insult her. She had taken, and she remembered Thane spitting out the word. Pride, in enduring without losing her temper. But Thane knew her temper and why she would or would not lose it, worrying at this anomaly until he found an answer. Her coping strategy was revealed for what it was: intentional situational blindness and forced perspective. And now Thane's mouth was on her cheek, kissing along tracks of tears. She couldn't feel angry about what happened to her. Not the way she could feel angry about what happened to him. Not really. Numbed, dense scarring and callous all around it. Maybe always there. He felt it for her. And she would feel for the young man who volunteered for a trial and thanked his rapists. She was enraged on his behalf, and she didn't have to tell him. She could show him. She would end the compact. She was willing to break Hanar bodies as he'd broken a human for her. She was eager. She was able. If she were entirely healthy, it should have made her want to swear off touching him. Knowing sex was tied in with horror inextricably, sharing the same blood supply like an organ and the cancer growing in it. She knew for herself that she'd had to get through that, or go without sex. She had stubbornly and imperfectly fought back, refusing to allow intended ruin to come to pass, refusing to allow the sickness her rapist had tried to pass into her to take hold. It still had. Enough to be read on her face and her actions as a recognizable symptom to someone similarly afflicted. If he rejected her, she would understand, even approve, but otherwise, even tainted, even ringing with pain, the only way out was through. She would not abandon him. Maybe there was no way out for him, that there was more cancer than organ. Maybe he was doomed to be overwhelmed. She considered him right now as a creature that possibly could never give true consent. A small child trapped in siren and demand. A young man trapped in his pride of enduring exploitive violation. He loved her, would do anything for her, and despite his appearance of calm adulthood, he was constantly seething with pain, physical and emotional, unable to form scars as warning, masking his expressions, denying pain existed. She had no idea what twined through his mind, poisoning and sending out new creeping, corrupting trails each moment, but she defied it. Even if the poison and thorns were inextricable from who he might have been once, as hers were inextricable from who she might have been. She loved him, and damn everything else. She would love him whole, honor that part that fought, and not what he fought against that had taken root and flourished. She would fight with him. She would fight for him. That something in her that stirred and stretched, did not go back to sleep, reached for him with fierce passion, pressed against him and slanted her mouth over his. Fear of being found and being hunted faded as she found her pack, her likeness, her mate, not in fur and fang, but venom and scale. He wrapped her hair around his wrist and wrenched her head to the side, holding her pinned, his mouth on hers, on her throat, his teeth on her breast through her dress. He was angry, feral, one hand sliding down her injured leg until he touched the encasing mesh, dragging his hand back up her thigh with nails digging in, finger tracks trailing venom. She reached for him, but he shoved her back, tightening his grip in her hair, his mouth returning to hers with a sharp nip of his teeth, and then the forcing of too much venom. Too fast, making her dizzy and sick. His hand moved up the inside of her thigh again, and a harsh glow and crackle made her cry out against his lips. Biotics along his skin and hers, fused finger inside her, pulsing heat and crawling tingle over his hand. Everything was too much. Venom too fast, Tyranid too disoriented, starting from a launch point of bloodlust and rage, his hand too hard, his mouth overwhelming. Biotics arcing as she tried to struggle, pushed at him, cries of pain against his lips. He did not stop, but leaned in, grew harder, faster, more intense until she was on the edge of blacking out, flooded with nausea and panic. He kept her there. Exactly there. His knee brushed against her injured leg as if to remind her that she'd sent him away. Almost died, had needed him to notice that she'd lost too much blood, that she would have lost her leg, would have lost her life without him. She could feel in his crackling anger that he hadn't forgiven her. In many ways, she had forced him to anger when she forced herself into numbness and intentional blindness. In contrast to her, over and over, he chose to experience pain in each moment as the necessary price to pay to continue to breathe, to do what he chose to do, to see, to watch over her when she was at her most reckless. Maybe he could never forgive because he couldn't forget, would always have to look harder and trust her less. She understood. Some of it, part of it. And even if she didn't, it didn't matter. If she escalated fighting him and denied his right to anger, to expression of what he could not say in words, he would not have mercy. And she could tip him from righteousness to cruelty. Her choice. This man of the unrepeatable, quietly expressed threat had passed beyond threat into consequence, drawn a line indelibly on her skin, in her memory, a living consequence that would not negotiate. A way of teaching he knew resulted in learning. She accepted that in this place of augmented bloodlust and rage. If she wished to live, to keep those she loved alive, those that followed her, she needed to listen to him. She relaxed against his grip, stopped pushing, stopped fighting. He didn't relent, dragging out crackling, dizzy in punishment, drinking in her verified and bare distress that progressed from pain to a particularly skillful and familiar blend of mixed pain and pleasure he could bring out in her until he was somehow satisfied, reaching his limit when her skin crawled with aftershocks and every sound and movement she made was an apology and incoherent begging, and she had no idea if the begging was for him to stop or to keep going. The time frame in the unmeasured dark seemed like suspended eternity, and she was barely conscious when his mouth gentled. The biotic flow turned warm and encompassing, his thumb soothing over her. His anger transmuted slowly to his apology for the anger itself and for his own feelings, murmuring her name. Hungry. Not see her. She realized he had not called her that since she woke up. She wondered if he ever would again. She mourned the uncounted losses that spread out like malignant ripples from her faulty choices. From his. She reached her hands up to put them on his shoulders, and he let them stay there. He used his hands in her hair to control her mouth, to force her unresisting lips into his kiss. Responded to her moans with his own. She was taut and panting when he withdrew his hand, and she bit at his lip in frustration. He bit back, hard, draw in blood, his hand on the fastenings of his clothes. He was up and inside with a shriek from her, absorbed on his tongue. He captured her hands in one of his and held them over her head along the column, biotic restraint added to the strength of his hand alone, which would have been enough. Hard fingers digging into her skin and electricity crawling over her hands, dripping down her arms. He rammed into her, brutal and painful, but distress of the quiescent and trembling mind did not change the fact that her body was primarily fang and claw right now. She was built back up to where she had been moments ago, so close, clenching and angling her hips to meet his, breath forced out of her, into his demanding mouth. He wrenched her head back by the hair and licked at her throat as she came with a scream that echoed as he filled her, thrusts building to his growl, his few final hard strokes through aftershocks and tears and released breath and moans. She suddenly realized through blurred and streaked comprehension that, yes, that was an angry Thane sex. Now she knew. She deserved it. She could have prevented her own collapse if she'd delegated sooner, or supervised from the med bay. She could have been wise. She could have allowed herself to be examined. She could have avoided being numb. She would remember. She had been very wrong about many things. She was shame and sorrow and anger and rage and opposing, uncompromising absolutes in sharp, painful relief, and all she could do was be held up by him. He released her arms, kissed the new tears away from her face, lifted her hips to wrap her legs around his waist, and held her, soothing, strong, and more of a mystery to her than he had ever been. Her main, possibly her only mystery was revealed, and his mysteries had multiplied, shrouded and twisted poison-tipped thorns that twined around and through his heart, his thoughts, his nerves. She wrapped her arms around him and buried her face on his shoulder, and he kissed her hair, whispered her name. After a comforting eternity to match and exceed the painful one, he righted his clothing, smoothed her dress in the dark, lifted her in his arms, one hand lingering on her injured leg for a brief moment. Never forgotten, never forgiven. And then he carried her out of the alcove, stepped over the undiscovered body, and took her back to the ship. Wordlessly, he undressed her, stroking his lips and fingers through hair, implacably and irresistibly showered and washed her with hands of service, dried her hair painstakingly, braided it loosely for sleep. He fed her medication she needed, wrapped her in his arms and held her on his lap on the bed. The shifting and violent earthquake of his nature had sheared cataclysmically against itself, but only a fraction of pressure had been relieved, only a fraction of that shared with her. More building each day, every day. He settled back into deceptively solid ground, the chasm quiescent, but going to the center of him in forward and sideways motion. And she would choose to live on that fault line if he would allow it. The medication and his arms, whispered words and his fingers on her skin made her sleepy. And she gave in, hand in his. There were aftershocks, and he woke her through the night, dreams of his voice and his body blending into real moments with bruises and bite marks and long scratches on her skin. Fire from his hands until she was clinging to him helplessly, her braids snarled into knots. Then her hair released and finger-combed over a pillow as she drifted into dull dreams. She listened for his voice, reacted to the tyrant leeching from her blood, longing for her mate of scale and venom to chase away the numb with his snarl and snap, to inspire her to resist the cold, to guard him as he guarded her. Garrus did not notice a change in them because there was nothing to notice. Even had there been something to notice, he was distracted by the loss of Tally. Part of his sunlit soul had gone with her, reluctantly, head bowed, and she and Thane rallied around him. It was good to soothe cleaner hurts. Garrus so easy to sympathize with, and most importantly, they were able to actually help him. Thane cooked for him, she danced with him to prove her leg was mending, and Garrus obligingly smiled, was grateful, gave them all a reason to be thankful for small blessings, and they all avoided the subjects of larger curses. She and Thane already had the habits of silence, reserve, and had always had fangs and fur, venom and scale, and their presence was not new. Thicker coat and brighter scale might be explained by their recent victory and near loss of each other. Bruises and scratches on her body were not new. Despite revelations of past, the present remained the same. She and Thane shared defenses and caution in a new, known and shared section of the board. There was an acceptance of unbearable pressure having uncapped passion in all three of them like simultaneous volcanoes. Garrus having expressed his as fault, Thane having expressed his as blame, and she having expressed hers in refusing to die despite all temptation and inducements, in both fault and blame and redoubled vigilance. She wondered if Garrus knew or suspected the history of sexual abuse in his partners, and decided he did, and would not comment unless another example such as the one that had provoked Thane, attempted induction into sex slavery, occurred in front of him. Garrus had spent years as a detective, CSEC pursuing a notorious underworld, including trafficking, his own face implacable and heartrending when he'd seen slavery firsthand. Whether or not he'd experienced rape or slavery himself, he'd seen enough people die to it, counseled and despaired over enough survivors to likely know. The punch to the throat, the whine and discharge of a rifle occasionally before a sentence was finished. He'd aim for the mouth. In armor, in the front, as a recognizable woman and authority. She drew more attention than Thane for once. Garrus had provided her with memories of sentences that went, "That's fucking Shepard. Keep her alive and we can see what she looks like on her knees with my cock." Q gurgling, screaming. "That's a nice rifle, bitch. Get her warmed up and you'll see what it feels like when..." Q fatal collapse. Garrus's actions and his aim spoke for themselves. Turian respect of female authority was unquestioned other than, as Thane had said, by the barefaced and honor-lost, those who leaned and then fell into criminal lives. It was not merely protective or romantically driven behavior of a partner or comrade or commander. It was rejection of any threat happening at all in their presence. She still had a murky, questioning area of her psyche where she did not think she should kill someone for saying something vile, that words were separate from actions. She dismissed it as trash talk, an almost benign human tradition of taunting, seen on playgrounds and pickup games. She classified it as normal rivalry behavior. Humans have a saying, boys will be boys, and military training had exposed and inured her to it. Thane and Garrus equated verbal with literal. A threat of rape was intent to rape, assumption of past and future rape, instant death sentence. An insult intended to degrade a female, any female, not just her, was declaration of being an animal in need of being put down, or they would spread their sickness like rabies. When the threat was to her, in the presence of their growing devotion, that made death come in ways that caused more pain, caused them to drown in their own blood to symbolically cleanse the mouth of the final words. She was a carrier of this disease. It seemed it lived in her blood. Perhaps it was very simple. She did know the difference between words and actions. She'd heard, repeated in her own head, at one time hundreds of times a day, now faded but still remembered out of nowhere and echoed in dreams. The voice of her rapist. I'm gonna fuck you until you scream, you tight little whore. And he had. He couldn't make her beg, but he could make her scream. No words could compare to that. No threat could come close to the effect those words had had on her, accompanied by the actions taken to prove how true at least some of his words were. Breaking down the sentence into the individual words, none of them had the same power. She didn't mind the word fucking, used it a lot, though if someone were listening carefully, she used it as a general swear and didn't use it to refer to sex that she had. She didn't mind screaming. Tight and little were fine as adjectives. She wouldn't even mind being a whore, having respect for sex workers and thinking it was a good job under the right conditions. She'd desensitized herself to every word in that phrase. But it still haunted her. And nothing else could compare. If someone else had repeated those exact words to her, it would never be the same. Now she knew she could kill them. At the time when she'd first heard them, she hadn't known that yet. Perhaps her behavior had been easy for Thane to observe and decipher. Unlike many humans, she had no use for threat or humiliation during sex. Garrus and Thane took their cue from her, and they didn't venture anywhere near the territory that would have frozen her into unresponsive tolerance until it was over. She could have forgiven or indulged them, but would never have been able to enjoy or reciprocate. She'd learned the difference between pain, augment, and pleasure, which she appreciated, clean pain, and humiliation, which she did not experience, slipping out of that space like a greased varan and becoming an observer, an anthropologist, and not a partner. She wondered just how uncivilized humans truly were, how socialization and experience in the worst of her own culture had made her apathetic. She wished she could have Garrus's or Thane's clarity on the subject, but she didn't. Casual sexual threat among humans was so common that eliminating it would wipe out huge portions of the population, male and female. And she saw clearly that's exactly what Thane and Garrus thought was needed. The thought made her queasy and forced a new perspective, what it meant to have them at her back, that the word casual related to sexual threat could no longer exist. Should not exist. It should not exist. It would not exist if they were there. And she could not own that. Not yet. They carried it for her for now, and she would try to reverse engineer her own mind. She had to own that she did wish certain people had more fingers to break, more mouths to shoot, more ways to drown in their own blood. She had to accept that maybe she did manipulate them into taking revenge for her while she stayed theoretically and hypocritically cool and remote. Maybe it never could be clean the way they saw it. An obvious step like shooting a dog with rabies. Perhaps it was easier for Thane and Garrus because they saw humans in general as lower on the evolutionary cultural scale. But she was one of them. She was tainted, damaged, blind, perhaps could never see, hadn't the eyes, had been systematically blinded. She was for the first time not ashamed of just some human behavior, but ashamed to be human. The next port was the Citadel, Garrus wanting to check in with Palavan representatives and Council Asperatus to disseminate some of the information Edie had mined from the collector base. They were all trying to comprehend and absorb the motherlode of data themselves, long hours with Morden and Miranda breaking down the science. Morden thought some of the more heavily encrypted data was active information about the indoctrination process, and he chose to concentrate on breaking that down into usable facts with Kasumi's help. Jane spent time conferring with Liara about the compact. One of the best places to start would be preventive. Drell children given to the compact had a month of celebration, and although it wasn't announced, it would not be that difficult to find with informants. They could relocate families or hopefully talk them into publicly refusing, beginning a revolt. Farron had some ideas and had become passionate on the subject, and that was where they'd start. Tracking down compounds and networks would be harder, but not impossible. If Farron was able to convince Drell of what actually happened to the children, compared to what they thought happened, they could gain cultural support and outreach. They would start quietly and build to a roar. Everyone was going to have to accept that their way of life was under threat, and with Reapers as a larger threat, extermination looming. Cultural change might be more malleable than at other times. Farron would spread the message of keeping children alive, families intact, not allowing them to fall to ignorance, abuse, or death. She shared the purported communications from the flock, and Liara puzzled over them, agreed that they weren't intended for her to respond, were likely cryptic fission, and agreed that Jane should not snap at bait. Maybe there were attempts to discredit the actual organization by looking amateur. Impossible to tell without a solid correlation, and only of interest if more clues came to light. So far, none. They were not recruiting. There was no opportunity for infiltration, and voice analysis of the announcer in the few bits of recorded broadcast they were able to secure revealed it to be entirely synthetic, and not a mask of an actual voice that could be identified by backtracking it through distortion reversal. The only clues were that it seemed to favor her Spectre authority over her affiliation with the Alliance or Cerberus, describing her as conqueror of the collector base and savior of the Citadel. No way to track how they got that information. The Normandy's comings and goings were, if not public record, easily bought information from dock workers. The stealth drive did them no good in port. Anybody on Omega could have seen the ship was torn up. Enough information had been dispersed to so many sources that being able to identify a specific leak from the Normandy herself was unlikely. The information could have come from Cerberus. There were potential leaks all over the place, and she wanted the collector base to stay unclassified, to let as many people know as possible. She'd used the media enough and watched people point useless and wrong fingers at leaks enough to know that if she made a guess and started accusations, she'd only weaken ties she was trying to strengthen. She'd wait until something damaging leaked before worrying. The only thing she knew about the flock was that they supported her superficially, either did not care to contact her at all, or did not wish to give her a chance to trace them, and had a broadcast system that Kasumi still did not know how to duplicate. That indicated high intelligence and creative technical ability. That meant she was only likely to believe something from that broadcast source and its signature, and would treat each attempt at communication as a separate, distinct source. If they ever started providing information using an established method instead of cryptic bullshit, she'd revisit. Something tickled in her head, and she looked at it closely. Tangential associations and circumstantial serendipity. She'd been playing a great deal of Pawn Ifa, and she was starting to think more in the ways Thane was teaching her. Groups and motivations and captured resources, puppet organizations and misdirection. The most obvious person she could think of to run the flock was Thane. A hard flush of blood tinge rushed to the surface of her skin. Intuitive confirmation. She was not going to ask him. She visited and revisited that conclusion, adding it up again and again. Each second, more confirmation. She was sure it was Thane. High intelligence, technical ability, and a Pawn Ifa master, a unique transmission method, and unknown but accurate, undisputed information source, exclusively near to Shepard while appearing not to be. What he knew would not be a leak, but would be observed or confided in him directly, indistinguishable from other trusted sources that had observed. She had a sudden certainty that whatever would be said would never be exclusive information, but traceable to several people with known confidence and proven utility. People she would always value over the trivial matter of disseminated information she already wanted out there. Information that benefited her. She was also certain they wouldn't contact her directly because Thane could already do that on his own and did not need to pass her information or get information from her remotely. She thought of the phrase used by Einstein to describe quantum entanglement as spooky action at a distance, and saw the correlation, saw the implied but negligible distance, the corresponding accuracy and mystery of a technically incomprehensible communication source as necessary to inspire. It explained Thane's use of time away with no job on the ship, and his knowledge of setting up and manipulating shadow organizations to his advantage. Her advantage. Well, she had a hobby of her own, on his behalf. Destruction of the compact was a mission that may or may not involve him. The amount of programming he may have had to inhibit him from doing harm to the Hanar that had raised him was not something she wanted to test or provoke. He was a man of action, and he had considered destroying them, knowing all the reasons to do so, but had stepped aside, given her reasons that she did not consider sufficient to scrap the endeavor. She suspected he wanted her to know, to guess, having explained laboriously the process over the Pawn Ifa board. The way he looked at her during explanation, willing the information into her bones. She went from speculation to acceptance. This was Thane's baby. She would see what it grew into, how he intended to play it. She hadn't mentioned the organization to him once, only involving Kasumi and Liara. She hadn't risen to bait or speculation, and even with public speculation had appeared entirely disinterested. She would keep that up. Possibly with her new information regarding Thane's detection of her numbed disinterest on guarded subjects. She might express curiosity if it came up, but she doubted it would. Not from him. She closed her eyes, sat back, and appreciated it for a moment. She loved him so much. She was so very glad he was on her side. She had lost this board to a Pawn Ifa master before she thought about setting her pieces. It was in her service, and she at least saw it coming for once. Maybe she did learn. Docking at the Citadel began with her new tradition of sandwiches. Now everyone had a favorite order, and she set on her way to get that done, doing some window shopping, Turian takeout food for Garrus, fresh fruit for Thane, getting used to the old mission of the collector base drifting away, and the new mission of the Reapers in general, with no direct target, but the fear that it could arrive any moment in overwhelming force. For now, the Citadel was still the sleeping menace she believed it to be, but inhabited by good people who made good sandwiches. With a smile, she set off toward Kithoy. When she was halfway into the rental car, she felt a sting on the side of her neck. A jovial and indulgent male voice too close behind her said, "Here, honey, let me. You've had too much to drink." And she collapsed forward. Arms caught her before she crashed and caused a scene. She was unconscious before she could raise her hand to see what had lodged in her neck, or turn to see who held her.